Eyemouth is a pretty fishing village on the Berwickshire coast. It's a place that's seen its fair share of tragedy over the years. In the 17th century, during the Great Witch Hunt, the village was rocked when 8 of its own were accused of witchcraft. One of the accused was Elizabeth Bathgate, wife of brewer Alexander Pay, who also worked for George Ochterton, or Ochterlony, as a servant. The couple were reasonably comfortably off and got on well with their neighbours. That was until 1631. Elizabeth had loaned George Sprott a piece of fabric and expected it back once he was finished with it, but he held on to it longer than she expected. One day she went round to his house to get it, but he wasn't there, although his son was. Angrily, she nipped the boy on his arm and left behind an egg. When Sprott returned and saw what had allegedly happened, he took the egg and threw it at Elizabeth's house. Meanwhile, the boy became ill, with an egg-shaped lump appearing on his body. He died, and Elizabeth was prime suspect in the case. She was also accused of having crippled William Donaldson, another neighbour, following a dispute. She allegedly called out, "The devil be in your feet," when he ran away from her. The child of another neighbour she fell out with, John Gray, became ill with a fever that couldn't be accounted for. Another villager, Margaret Home, borrowed money from Elizabeth's husband, but often as not, failed to pay it back and incurred Elizabeth's wrath. Elizabeth was said to have cursed her on at least 3 occasions by killing an ox, her horse, and making another of her horses mad. After an argument with neighbour Stephen Allen, he became ill. All of these events were brought to the attention of the local minister, the Reverend John Hume, and while preparing to speak to her, a local mill caught fire and she was suspected of arson. During investigations into these matters, it soon transpired that others had something against the woman, as she was accused of having interactions with the devil. 2 men claimed they'd seen her talking to a gentleman in fine green clothes and suspected it was Old Nick himself. They said that at the time she was wearing just a petticoat, and as they passed her, she ignored them. There is also a story accusing her of having received a horseshoe from the devil, and after she had agreed to do the devil's bidding, had buried it as requested, and it was believed it would mean that she would never be poor again. Elizabeth went on to be named by other accused witches of having been at a meeting with them and the devil, and they confessed that all of them had destroyed a mill. She was also accused of being involved in the sinking of George Hurdy's boat, with the loss of all hands and goods. William Mears, an accused warlock, stated she'd attended several meetings with the devil, and Margaret Balleny called her a sicker witch than herself. It was also stated that Elizabeth and her associates had met under the cover of darkness on Eyemouth Beach and murdered David Hind, who was watching the herring boats, fearing he'd seen them and their unlawful actions. In 1633, the names of Eyemouth's accused witches were made public. These were Elizabeth Bathgate, Margaret Balleny of Aytoun, William Mears, Patrick Smith, Agnes Wilson, Alison Wilson, Elspeth Wilson, and Janet Williamson. Elizabeth was sent to the toll booth in Duns on 9th January 1634, while the rest were incarcerated in Eyemouth, But it transpired she was the last to be arrested, so maybe Eyemouth's common pit had no space for her. Elizabeth was furious. On 16th December, she managed to get a letter written to the Privy Council in Edinburgh, lodging a formal complaint against the Eyemouth minister Hume and Sir Patrick Hume of Ayton for illegally imprisoning her on the charge of witchcraft. This was the first of 4 complaints made. On 11th February 1634, she was taken to the Tolbooth in Edinburgh to await trial, but again complained about the length of time it was taking to get her trial up and running, as it was being a financial burden on her family. By the end of the month, she had a legal team in place to fight her case. She was released from prison on 11th March, but was to stay in Edinburgh. On 4th June, the trial finally got underway, with the Lord Advocate and Patrick Hume leading the prosecution case against her. 18 charges were laid before her, including the murder of young Sprott, but she was stoutly defended by her defence advocates, Robert Burnett, Lawrence McGill, and David Primerus, who managed to get the more wild accusations dropped. She went on to be acquitted of all charges. As for the others, 4 were found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to death, although whether this was carried out is open to speculation. These were Margaret Balleny, Alison Wilson, Agnes Wilson, a widow, and Elspeth Wilson, a servant, who were said to have been strangled then burned following their convictions on Eyemouth Beach. Patrick Smith was found dead while incarcerated, although the circumstances surrounding his death remains a mystery. William Mearns escaped from jail. While on the run, he found a length of rope and hanged himself. Both Smith and Mearns were buried in unconsecrated ground. It's unknown what happened to Janet Williamson. What makes this case unusual is that the same charges of witchcraft were made against all 8, yet Elizabeth had her charges quashed. She could also somehow afford advocates to defend her and get her case moved to Edinburgh, rather than held locally like the others. It's also worth mentioning that the minister, John Hume, was related to Sir Patrick Hume. Patrick Hume's prosecution case was made up of several family members, including his wife and his cousins, and at one stage it was known Elizabeth and Hume had had a disagreement. Was this the motive behind the case? Elizabeth's complaint of false imprisonment against the Reverend Hume and Sir Patrick Hume was upheld by the Privy Council, but neither faced any criminal charges. Over a period of around 65 years, Eyemouth saw over 30 accused witches, men, women, and children, killed by the authorities. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.